I've been over Snowdon, I've slept upon Crowdon, I've camped by the Wainstones as well. I've sunbathed on Kinder, been burned to a cinder, and many more things I can tell.
Welcome back to another episode of the Radiant Others podcast. My name is Dan Blacksburg, and I'm recording as always from my West Philly basement. I'm a klezmer trombonist, educator. I play a lot of other styles of music, especially experimental music across jazz, rock, classical, what have you, all the weird stuff, and all the Yiddish stuff, and also a lot of the Jewish stuff, and then maybe even some of the jazz stuff. I really get around, and it's an incredible joy in my life to be able to touch on so many different parts of the world of music. And it's a joy with this podcast to be able to talk to people from so many different parts of our glorious Yiddish cultural landscape. We've had, of course, musicians talking about their careers and their latest projects. We've had scholars talking about their research, both current and deep in the past, but we've never had someone talking about the kind of stuff we get into today. And so I'm so excited to share with you my conversation with Yiddishist, historian, singer, and messenger of deep Jewish ritual practice, Annie Gottfried Cohen. Annie is based in the UK, teaches Yiddish through the Workers' Circle, has sung with cantor Rachel Weston in the Isle of Klesbos, and made her own Yiddish translations of folk and pop songs with Michal Yashinsky and our very own producer, Bela Unger. Alongside all that work, Annie has created this incredible website, pullingatthreads.com, which documents the ritual practices of Jewish women throughout different kinds of things that we would almost call the supernatural. So speaking to the dead, measuring cemeteries and graves, being professional mourning women or klogerins in Yiddish, and dealing with the evil eye, and so much more. It's an incredible resource, and the thing that I love the most about it is that it takes stuff that feels very familiar to me as someone who's involved in Yiddish culture and takes it right into the realm of what I would almost call the supernatural, or certainly the bigger than nature in a certain way. As a musician who's dedicated myself to playing music in a way that's really reaching for the ecstatic, I just know what it's like to access an experience or just a state of being where you feel like you're doing something that's at the very least greater than the sum of its parts. And as I say in the podcast, you just can't really quite explain how you got from here to there, or just maybe it just feels a little impossible what just happened. And that's kind of what these ritual practices connect to for me, is that set of feelings and that set of experiences. Just something where it's like kind of undeniable, even if you're not sure whether it was real or not. I don't know. I think it's an amazing thing that human beings can do to incorporate that level of grandeur into ourselves and our lived experiences. So while we start out with a lot of Annie's story and learning that she and I have some really interesting parallels to our Jewish journeys, we really get into this supernatural, or this just set of practices of these women that peer beyond our physical world. And hearing the process that Annie describes of uncovering these stories of women who filled these communal roles, like speaking with the dead, is so powerful to me because it presents such a different vision of what the role of women in traditional Judaism was and could be. So I know you're really going to enjoy this one because I really enjoyed it, and Annie's awesome. And alongside that, we also root this conversation in our horror and opposition to the devastation of Palestinian life that continues to happen in Gaza and the West Bank, and alongside many, many other horrible acts in the United States, in the UK, and by our imperial powers of the US, and the Israeli government, and all those other places. In light of that, we're going to ask you for something a little bit different. Usually we ask you to contribute to us, but we're asking for your help supporting a campaign that Annie helps lead to assist a family in Gaza, multi-generational family, to survive in these devastating times. So please go to the show notes to find a link where you can learn more and donate what you can. Before we get into the episode, I have to tell you about something that's really exciting that's happening this weekend in Philadelphia. On Sunday, May 17th. It's the first edition, and who knows, but the first edition of Philly in Einem, Philly All Together, a gathering, an evening of Yiddish cultural learning, music, and art and language celebration. It's happening at Kol Tzedek Synagogue. It's something that I've gotten to do with support from the Yiddish Book Center's Cultural Fund. We got a grant for it last year that helped fund the podcast we put out a couple months ago with the roundup of Philly people making new Yiddish culture. This whole scene of ours was just got a big profile in the local news, and we're doing this really cool thing. So you can still sign up. You can find a link for that in the show notes, and it's just going to be a really wonderful and super Hamish time because that's the only way we roll in West Philly. Last but not least, if you still have some resources left over after all this, of course, you can always support us to do more than we already do at patreon.com/radiantothers or with a one-time donation at tiptopjar.com/radiantothers. I love saying that. And anything you give us is going right back into making more content, more episodes, talking to more people, and drawing what I hope is a bigger web of connections between myself with my ideas and our big, big Jewish world. So without further ado, here's my conversation with the amazing Annie Gottfried Cohen.
Sich gegrabbelt auf Steiner, gespannt durch die Bäume, weit von der Stadt schwarzen Räuch. Mein Heim ist dort, wo ich gefinn sich, in a Freiland, wo's keinem gehört. Und Eider verlassen die Berge, will ich besser schon sein in der Erd. Ich bin a Wanderer von Manchester Stadt. Der Himmel ist mein Himmel und die Erde ist mein Gott. Und Gott, ich muss arbeiten schwellig, bin ich gar frei in die Wegler.
All right, welcome back to another episode of the Radiant Others Klezmer podcast, or now really just the Radiant Others podcast, because we're just growing and growing our perspective beyond this idea of klezmer music, although we can talk about that later. But I'm really excited today to talk to Annie Gottfried Cohen, a scholar of a lot of different fields and a teacher of Yiddish at the Workers' Circle, and someone who's writing a book on what you're calling cemetery women, which I got to tell you, I am so excited to get into, to share with people, and also to send out all these little nodes of connections that it brought up for me and everything. So Annie, thanks so much for being here.
Thank you for inviting me. It's great to be here. And I sang on one klezmer album, so if you need
rock and roll,
if you need me to be klezmer.
No, you get to be klezmer. What was the album?
It was the Isle of Klesbo's the Yiddish Silver Screen album.
Oh, cool.
I kind of sing backup vocals for Rachel Weston, which is amazing to do.
Sometimes that's the greatest spot. No, I did notice that I was watching videos on your YouTube, and you've got a lot of good videos with Rachel.
Yeah.
And also with our producer Beryl, I was watching. I was late getting to logging on because I was watching Hanukkah and Santa Monica translated back into the original Yiddish. No, back where it belonged. But yeah, it's really great. So I was thinking, we've definitely been at Klez Canada together, or
I haven't
Yiddish New York
been
together.
To Klez Canada. I really want to go, but I haven't.
Oh, you haven't
but
been?
Yes, to
Okay.
Yiddish New York. Yeah.
So yeah.
Yeah.
One of the someone asked me yesterday, what makes someone able to be a guest on the Radiant Others Klezmer podcast? And I said, well, it needs 1 or less degrees of separation, and we definitely have that going on. So, but
yeah,
I think
your
this is a really good.
list, sorry, your past people are just loads of my friends, so it's a really nice podcast to listen to. Yeah.
Oh yeah, I loved when Daniel Kahn had this thing when he first turned on when I first started doing it many years ago. And he was like, I was so angry because I felt like I was in the room hanging out with my friends, but they couldn't hear me.
Yeah.
So I couldn't say anything. And I was like, well, that it is, we're taking the para out of the parasocial for the purposes of this podcast. Anyway, but I was thinking it's a really great chance to get to know each other a little more. And especially because, your work is really, really interesting to me. And it touches on so many things sort of points from a very, very Jewish past into so many and present into so many different like other really fun things that make sense to me. But I was wondering, like, so just actually to get some of your biographical story and how Yiddish enters that, and then how does that come to be part of, how do you come to these like topics, like your main topics of research and, you know, all that stuff?
Yeah, so I grew up in Northwest London, in a very Jewish area, and I went to I could, it would be too long to tell you my whole Jewish story, but I grew up in a Reform synagogue, and I was pretty active. Like I enjoyed synagogue and Judaism, and it was an important part of my life. Although I grew up with like a very liberal, you know, I thought that like Ahasuerus and Vashti get a divorce, you
Right.
know, in the Purim story. And then it was only when I started learning Yiddish that, you know, someone's like Vashti's exiled and she has scales on her body according to a rat. And it was just all horrible.
Yeah.
And, you know, I'd grown up with this very kind of liberal and quite feminist
Yeah, I remember
interpretation
those
of
too.
Judaism.
Yeah.
um, and my dad's parents were both from Eastern Europe. Well, sorry, my grandpa was born in the UK actually, but his parents were immigrants from Lithuania. But I didn't really know them. I didn't really grow up with Yiddish at all. We had a book of Yiddish jokes in
Oh
our
yeah.
loo, in our toilet. And that
We're
was,
currently like on a 1-to-1
yeah.
scale here, so this is good.
And that's where Yiddish lived in my house.
That's
And
right,
I
in the
think
toilet.
I have subsequently analyzed this a lot. You know,
Yeah, right.
how Yiddish, how did Yiddish end up in the toilet?
Mm-hmm.
You know, and I kind of, you know, that I heard a few Yiddish words, the ones that everyone hears, like schlepp and kvetch and whatever. And, you know, I actually didn't realize that the word Yortzeit, like a anniversary or
Oh
death
yeah, I had
anniversary.
no. That took a while.
Yeah, I was talking to someone in Yiddish a few years ago, and then I said the word Yortzeit, and I just suddenly thought, I understand this word. This, it's your year, Zeit, time, the year time, the
Yeah,
anniversary. And it was like my head exploded.
I had
Because
that exact same.
oh
Yeah,
really? Yeah, I thought this was like a weird Hebrew word, you know, and
I know because
I
it's
kind of,
presented alongside all the Hebrew that you grew up with in your synagogue, right?
yeah, exactly. And I think you know, I grew up with this also this assumption about Yiddish that everything
Mm-hmm.
Yiddish is not really to do with Judaism. You know, it's to do with this kind of
Oh, okay.
past life, and that things that are to do with Judaism are Hebrew words. So, you know, I made
Mm-hmm.
that
Mm-hmm.
assumption about your side. And yeah, and when did I started getting into Yiddish? It was I went back to finish my undergraduate degree as in my kind of mid-20s. I paused university, and during that time, like when I first started university, it was when I'd started to question Zionism. I wasn't brought up a fervent Zionist or anything like that, but Israel was just a very big part of the Jewish life that I was brought up in. And it kind of, and, you know, starting to question that led me to kind of feeling a bit of a, like a hole in this Jewish culture that, you know, had been so important to me as well. And I think, well, so that was one thing that happened. And then the other thing that happened was I was doing a history degree and I got really interested in the Spanish Civil War. And I found out that a lot of the people who went to fight in Spain in the international brigades were Jews. And I wanted to write a research paper on the Jewish volunteers. And my supervisor at the time at university said, well, you've got to learn some Yiddish. So I signed up for a Yiddish class and just like instantly fell in love. Like it was like something that had been missing. And I knew it had been missing, but I didn't know how much it was missing until I started to learn the language and also learn Yiddish songs. Actually, even before I started taking that Yiddish class, I joined Rachel Weston's Yiddish choir and learned to sing
All
in
right.
Yiddish. Yeah, learned to sing in
Yeah.
Yiddish before I learned to speak. And it was just, it was like things had clicked into place, like things about the Judaism that I grew up with that never made sense to me. And I'd
Mm-hmm.
never, you know, I kind of was and still am spiritual, but not very religious, but that, there were
Yes.
religious things that were meaningful to me. But I hated the way my synagogue tried to make everything modern, especially for young people. They were always trying to come
Yeah.
up with like, how can we make this? I don't know, I guess today it would be like, how can we turn this into an app or put it on social
Yeah.
media?
Can
Or,
we put a trap beat underneath Micha Mocha or something like that,
yeah. Oh yeah, and I really hated
It's
a lot
kind of
of like,
condescending,
it
honestly.
is. And
I,
I
I
didn't want that. I wanted, for me, Judaism was my connection to the past, to,
yeah.
the old world. And I always wanted the things I used to do. I never went on the youth programs. I never went
Yeah.
on Israel tour or anything like that. I went and volunteered with like the elderly people's, social group because I like to hear their stories. And this
Yeah.
was, or my favorite things were always on like Yom Kippur or on Tisha B'Av or sorry, I'm a mess now. I pronounce things, a mixture of how
It's
I grew up and with the Yiddish pronunciation.
I'm right there with you.
Okay.
I'm seriously, we're very, very aligned on this stuff. I was actually wondering, did you grow up with, were there maps of the state of Israel in your synagogue? Because I
Yes.
remember a lot of maps. Okay, did you give money to plant trees in the state of
Yes. The
Israel?
little blue and white
Okay,
boxes.
the
Yeah.
little blue and white. Okay, so I just want to. It's great because I actually was wondering. I was like, oh, there's so many differences between the way like an East Coast American Jew and a UK Jew, but then no, they're not in this case. And also,
Not there.
I really liked the traditional stuff. I mean, I I just really liked it. I mean, it made sense. It was like music. It was related to the music that I was performing, what
Mm,
I was learning. I was learning. Around the time I had a bar mitzvah, I joined the orchestra, which was like really exciting because a lot of
mm,
older kids played in the orchestra at my middle/high school, and so we're playing that music at the same time I'm studying like you know the hot like and like the downtown New York jazz Jewish saxophonist Paul Shapiro, who's a contemporary of Frank London, did a really like rocking jazz version of the traditional Haftorah blessing.
mm.
Da 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 da, because it's so minor and I thought that song rocked. Like I
Yeah.
was like, give me this, and then they're like, hey, do you want to go? So I actually did do a lot of the. I was sort of dragged along on a lot of these other trips because there wasn't another thing for me to do, and also there was so much pressure after Hebrew high school. I'm doing air quotes right now. It was, I mean, it was a real thing that we went to, but
Yeah.
like staying in it. But I remember like these dances in the suburbs and like Cotton Eye Joe and like I mean, who cares? It like in
Yeah.
retrospect, I was like, oh well, if someone had sent me to Klez Camp, then I would have never gone to any of
Yeah.
this stuff. But
Did
yeah,
you
no, it
grow up in
sounds
New
like
York?
no. I grew up in Philadelphia, where
In
I am right
Philadelphia, yeah.
now, and yeah, we went to, and our synagogue was unaffiliated conservative at the time,
Mm,
and I don't actually know how they affiliate right now, but and so we had this very traditionalist rabbi named Ivan Kane who also was cool with patrilineal descent, but then it was still sort of a conservative shul. But because of that, we couldn't be affiliated. I mean, it was this whole the seeds for me doing something unusual were in the air. It was like the dandelion was blown, and there were all these things that were like, well, it's actually a lot like what everybody else does, but just not quite. And there you go. And so, and then did your grandparents, any of your grandparents grow up speaking Yiddish?
my grandparents apparently both spoke a bit of Yiddish, but
Okay.
it wasn't their native language. My grandmother was born in Poland, but she moved to England when she was 4 or something. So she,
Yeah.
and what's interesting though is that my aunt, who's older than my dad, remembers them speaking more Yiddish
Hmm.
than my dad does. And it seems to me, and I mean, this seems to be a story for a lot of people
Yes.
in the UK, and I think not just in the UK, that after the Holocaust, people just kind of stopped speaking it, and it does seem like that happened in my family
Okay.
a bit as well. I mean, the other part of the story, and maybe this is actually relevant. So my mother was a convert,
Uh-huh.
and we my dad grew up Orthodox, and they were part of what became the first Masorti synagogue in London, and that's where they
Okay.
were married. But there was a whole thing because according to halacha, a Cohen can't marry a convert, and his surname's Cohen,
Oh,
and
jeez. Yeah.
so he had to give up his status as a Cohen in order to marry her. And I think a lot of our our Frummer family rejected this, and so don't really speak to us anymore. And so that means I probably do have more Yiddish speaking family, but who I don't agree with politically on many fronts, and who are not happy, and who probably wouldn't regard me as Jewish. So this was kind of a big part, I guess. I knew all of this. My mother died when I was quite young, when I was 4, and
Oh, yeah.
we moved to a Reform synagogue. She'd been kind of pushing for it, because she wanted me and my sister to have, to be able to study Judaism in the same way that boys could. And she also wanted to be cremated. So when she died, suddenly we just moved to the Reform synagogue. But I kind of grew
Wow.
up with all of that knowledge, which is actually quite a lot when I think about it, for a child to
Yes.
be aware of like that Judaism meant a lot to me and this Jewish culture. And, I wanted to know more about my grandparents and where they came from and so on, but also this kind of gatekeeping of who, and this thing of like, we want more Jews, we want young people to be engaged in Judaism, and also, maybe not you, or maybe not
But not
you.
that way. Yeah, no.
Yeah. The synagogue I grew up in was very, it was very welcoming, and they
Yes.
recognized patrilineal descent, and they recognized my mother's conversion, and nobody
Yeah.
there ever made me feel that I was not Jewish. Others have, because of this halachic
Yeah.
issue of whether or not her conversion was, firstly, whether or not the rabbi should be considered Orthodox, and then secondly, whether or not their marriage is valid, and so on.
Wow. Yeah.
Yeah. But my synagogue, the Reform synagogue I grew up in, was very welcoming, and it taught me loads of stuff. Also, I kind of learned to be a feminist there, I think, until I started to criticize the state of Israel. Not even criticize, just ask questions. And then it was like doors
Okay, so
shutting, and we don't
it
want to
had
talk
that
about it
element
anymore.
of like the knee jerk level was high around that issue. Because
Yeah. And
it's not always, it doesn't always have, even if you can't find agreement, it's not always that the knee jerk rejection is so strong. Although it is more common
yeah.
than not, it seems like. Yeah.
I don't think it's that way now.
Okay. Sure. Yeah.
I'm going to be 40 this year, so I'm talking like 20 years ago now that
Yeah. Yeah.
I,
No, that
was
was,
showing
yeah.
up in synagogue asking. Now,
Yeah.
since then I've even organized an event there where 2 of the writers from 972
Oh,
magazine came and
cool.
spoke about the Israeli occupation, and I've seen, I don't think it's like that now, but this is kind
That's
of,
great. Yeah.
yeah.
But I can imagine, because I'm definitely behind the train of sort of like, let's say, because what we're going to talk about a lot is looking at actual history and how does it complicate these narratives that are more ahistoric. I mean, we're all living under the absolutely destructive, like world-ending power of false historical narratives right now, and
Yeah.
what was it? But I can imagine. What I'm trying to say is, I can imagine coming to the people I was around in my like early 20s and how different that is from now, for sure. That's
Mm-hmm.
really interesting.
Yeah.
And I also want to just say that one of the things that strikes me is how you grew up pretty much your whole life with a complex, multifaceted, or as my scholar crush Devin Narr would say, multi-rooted sense of what Jewishness is, which is something that I did not grow up with. Like, there is not a large Hasidic community, or there was not a visibly large or even Orthodox community to my eyes as a young person in Philadelphia in the 80s and
Mm-hmm.
90s. And so a lot of the other people I grew up around went to the other conservative shul in downtown Philly. And so I didn't even have a good picture of non-conservative Judaism.
Mm.
Like, I remember being shocked at the amount of English in a reform service when I started going to on the bar mitzvah, the B'nai Mitzvah circuit that you do when you turn 13 if you're living around a lot of Jews. But you were coming at this already knowing that there's more than one way to be Jewish, and there's ways that you like a complex, messy, and also kind of painful sometimes picture of all this stuff right from the get-go. And I just imagine that, well, I mean, when you said, and maybe this is like a little bit of a segue into your work, but like even when you said having to give up his status as a Cohen already makes me think about this sense of like spiritual powers that came out so strongly when I was reading about these cemetery women.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I mean, that's definitely true. I haven't actually thought about it that way or put it that way myself before, but that's definitely true that I think I learned a lot of what I now consider to be kind of my Judaism from my mum, who'd chosen to be a Jew, and she had kind of interpreted, she had her own interpretation of what it means to keep kosher. Like she'd really thought about it in a way
Oh,
that
wow.
my dad, I'm not saying he hasn't thought about it, but he
No,
grew
but it's
up with this.
different.
This is just what
Yeah.
you do, and for him, it's kind of like, why don't we order pepperoni pizza? Well, in case the rabbi comes around, Whereas my mum, I remember, I mean, I don't know if I remember her explaining this to me because I was very little, or if I heard it from someone else, but, she said, kashrut is about trying to consume in a way that doesn't harm the world. And I loved that. And I've kept that, my whole life. And I also grew up in a very Jewish area of London, like I said, where there was a big kind of, we were part of the kind of Reform Jewish community there, but there's also a Haredi. And in fact, I feel like I should say it just because I'm talking about it, that the Haredi community in the area I grew up in suffered an arson attack yesterday. So
Oh man, I'm sorry.
I'm
Yeah.
thinking about, and yeah, like I watched someone posted like a clip from social media about it, and the guy is speaking Yiddish. And I did have this thought of like, when I was growing up there, I wouldn't have understood what he was saying, but now
Right.
I can understand what's happening in this video.
Oh my. Yeah. And just for context, this is March 23rd, 2026. That is
Yeah.
what year it is, right?
Yeah, that is.
But I think that this really will. I mean, we talked about sort of putting all of these thoughts and all of our stories and all of our work in the context of today that we'll get to. But I mean, it's the past. I love that phrase. The past isn't over. It's not even the past. But also that these things are with us, and also we live under like regimes of illusion, and I think when you grow up with that, sounds like for both of us in different ways, those illusions were just so temperamentally we were so temperamentally unsuited for them that we had to find something else.
Yeah.
I can't point to it as directly, I think, as you've been able to, at least today. But just that sense that like, oh man, I don't know. Like, I guess what I'll say is like, since we're talking about our childhoods, when I finished my bar mitzvah, I just felt like the bottom kind of dropped out of the education that I was getting, because for me, in terms of relating to, I fell in love with the sound. I fell in love with the prayers. I mean, I really fell in love with the sound. That's really, big whoop. Like, I'm Dan Blacksburg, the klezmer musician. Like, of course I fell in love with the sound, but I mean it. Like, and then post B'nai Mitzvah training, they're just not focused on that anymore. They're sort of trying to keep you around, like that's like you were saying about the modernism stuff, like trying to make everything modern, and that didn't appeal to me. And they were trying to do it through this sort of like USY or other kinds of ways of like, getting Jews to hook up with Jews, which we now know is like written in, it's in like those plans were in writing and stuff like that.
Yeah.
And like and that didn't work. I wasn't that kind of kid either. Like I couldn't hang. And so I just couldn't hang. But then also I felt like the thing that was drawing me in was being really shoved to the side. And it wasn't until I fell in love with some klezmer music, and then I went to music school, somehow thinking I was going to be a klezmer musician, met Michael Winograd my first day of school and realized I didn't know shit about shit, and really had to start getting to work. And then waking up, in a certain sense, certainly identity-wise, waking up 15 years later going like, wait a minute, I know who I am as a human being and as a musician and as a Jew, and like I'm rooted now in a way that I never thought was even possible, and nothing can sway me from like my own desire to explore my own explorations, and that's one of the things that like this work has done for me. I didn't even realize it was happening until I woke up one day and was like, wow, everybody else looks really confused and I just don't seem to share that confusion,
Yeah. 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 I also, after my bat mitzvah, my synagogue I joined the kind of really geeky group who we did,
I'm glad that was there. Yeah.
yeah, here in the UK, we have exams when you're, there's the SATs in America,
Yeah.
right? But that's like here we have kind of subject-based exams. And
Yeah,
my synagogue offered one in Jewish studies. So
Oh,
that's
that's
kind of
really
what I
interesting.
did post my bat mitzvah, is I did the Jewish studies GCSE, which meant that I was still going to synagogue and kind of hanging out again with the geeky kids who decided to do this extra Jewish studies GCSE. And then after I did that, I started teaching at the synagogue.
Oh, wow,
I
cool.
started teaching, when I was 16. And I think that's where I learned to teach as well. And that's where I realized that I like teaching, and that I like studying and learning things together. But yeah, I think for me, like I said, I kind of didn't realize that there was something missing until I heard Yiddish and klezmer and Yiddish songs and got to
Yeah.
know this culture. And then it was like, oh, and, like I said, the practical reason for my learning Yiddish was that I'd started studying the Spanish Civil War. And one might think that it would be a good idea for me to learn Spanish at that point.
No, but if you're focusing on yeah.
But I didn't need to learn Yiddish and start teaching Yiddish and speaking Yiddish and singing Yiddish or any of that. What I needed for that project was to be able to read it and understand. And really, yeah, from, to study the Spanish Civil War, I need to learn like 5 languages at least. But instead I just kind of jumped into the Yiddish world and dedicated a lot of time to that, and now I'm still scrambling with Russian and the other languages I need to know. Yeah, I was trying to think, do I have anything interesting to say about Jewish studies GCSE? And no, I don't. I have a very strong memory of me and my friend climbing out of the back of his mum's Volvo estate, going into the exam, and him shouting at me, Annie, which one's the lemon and which one's the branch for Sukkot? That's my main
I love
memory
it.
of being Jewish at the age of
That's great.
16.
Amazing. I love it. So yeah, so you're studying the Spanish Civil War, you're studying Jewish communists and socialist fighters, right? And you started, you're in a state where you're falling in love with Yiddish, or you're about to fall in love with Yiddish, and then you're questioning Zionism and sort of finding this other route. How do you end up getting from there? Or before we do that, like what were some of the takeaways you learned from that process that like are part of your life, or just keep informing or keep coming up in your work, or keep informing your work from that study?
Yeah, so I definitely think part of studying Yiddish was that I was looking for something other than Zionism, and I was
Okay.
looking for a Jewish culture that wasn't so rooted in Zionism and kind of centered around the modern state of Israel. But there was
Yeah.
definitely more to it than that as well. And I think something that does keep coming up is this, and part of it was also discovering this existence of like the Jewish Labor Bund and, the Yiddish left. I studied, as well as studying Yiddish at university, I studied with Vivi Lacks, who's now written a book.
Yeah.
Yeah, and she was teaching us these Jewish workers' songs from Whitechapel. And this blew my mind. I grew up in
Right.
London. I'd never heard of the Battle of Cable Street. I grew up,
Oh, wow. Yeah.
I don't remember when I didn't know about the Holocaust. As far as I know, I knew about
Sure,
the
of
Holocaust.
course.
As soon as I knew stuff, I knew about anti-Semitism, but I didn't know anything about the history in my own city of fascism, of, you know, Jewish resistance to fascism. I didn't really know very much about the history of, you know, Jewish immigrants in East London or their culture. And this was just so, you know, it was opening my eyes way beyond kind of what I had maybe first expected when I started studying Yiddish. And I think, you know, the fact that I was already studying history and was pretty passionate about it, I'm also kind of, I was quite wary from the beginning of getting another really simplistic narrative, like in, you know, the old Jewish left will be my culture now, because they weren't perfect either. You know, there isn't, I don't know, and I don't want to simplify the past in that way. You know, so I've also, from the beginning, also been, I guess, trying to build new stuff. And I think that's also something that we need to do. It's not, you know, we can take things from the past, we can kind of be in dialogue with the past. I was very involved with an activist group called Judas for a while, and we also did.
Oh, I remember. Yeah, I remember from the good old. I was just talking to. I saw my good friend Anthony Russell, friend of the
I love
podcast,
Anthony.
last night, and we were talking about the good old days of Twitter, circa 2017, 2018. And I remember laughing at quite enough. I think I always was excited to see a Judas post because it would probably make me laugh.
Yeah.
Alongside teaching me something.
Yeah, I was not, I cannot claim responsibility for the best Judas tweets, but yeah, we had some good tweets. We had some great events. We had at least two, if not three gigs with Dan. No, at least three with Dan Khan. One where we had a Yom Kippur ball, which I did help to organize on Cable Street on the anniversary of the Battle of Cable Street with Dan Khan and Jeff Berner. And the two of them sang Deloy Politsay together. And we had this this background video that someone had made of anti-fascist and fascist demonstrations in London. So of the police, you know, stepping in to protect the fascists, which is what they generally do.
As they do.
And it was just incredible. It was such a, you know, so yeah, Judas was good for very good tweets, very good parties.
We got to bring that back. I mean, tweets, never mind. I mean, and like, you know, Blue Sky, where elder millennials go to die on social media. But
Judas is.
I'm one of them, by the way.
So
I'm okay. I gotta. But we gotta. I mean, first of all, Yom Kippur Ball, one of my favorites.
Yeah.
I love anything that's like. There's nothing more Jewish than, you know, following every halakha halakhic law to the T. And there's nothing more Jewish than saying we're going to have a giant like socialist or anarchist ball on Yom Kippur and eat our way through this holiday and scream for justice. It's the best that both of those things are true.
Yeah, I actually remember speaking to Dan about this, that the kind of blasphemy that Judas did, it felt really spiritual. It felt like a kind of an act of subversion that some of us needed. You know, that's where I could take my rage at, you know, the people who decided that my mother wasn't really Jewish, even though she did 4 years of studying and learning and engaging with Judaism.
But it's because you have to know what you're raging against. Like you can't, a Yom Kippur ball isn't meaningful unless you know what Yom Kippur is, you know? And so it is. You know, you could say it's what's cool because usually when something only exists in relation to something else, we sometimes think of that as inferior. But I really think this kind of contradicts that in a cool way where it's like, no, like, yes, this is in spite of or, you know, in relationship to this other thing, like this tradition or whatever. And that's what makes it so exciting because you're creating something that's fun, that's new, and you're doing it by leaning on this like deeply communal knowledge or something like that. That's really exciting about that. I mean, that's one of the things I love about doing music the way I do it, you know?
Yeah, no, for sure. And it was, you know, like I said, we actually got a building on Cable Street, which
so cool.
was incredible. And it was a building where even some of the people I now study, Jews who grew up in the East End in the 30s, they had a boxing gym in this place, you know. So this was really, it was like where our ancestors had tread. And and it was in the spirit of I think, yeah, there was a famous Yom Kippur ball in London during a strike, where Benjamin Feigenbaum, I think it was Benjamin Feigenbaum, he had a banner, he put up a banner that said, "There is no God." And then he got up on stage and he said, "Today is Yom Kippur, it's the holiest day of the year. If there is a God, he will surely strike me down." And then he kind of set a timer and looked at his watch and, after a certain amount of time, struck up the band and everyone starts dancing.
Great.
And
Great.
for this event, yeah, now it's been 10 years, so I can talk about some of the embarrassing and funny stuff that happened. I realized we didn't have a banner that said "There is no God." So I ordered one, but I couldn't find a place that would do. I got a birthday banner that said "Happy birthday to first name there is no, second name God." And I also I also ordered, because it was a fundraiser for anti-fascist network in the UK, and so I ordered this "Good Night White Pride" graffiti to drop at the end, because there were these kind of balconies around, but they printed "Good Night" on one side and "White Pride" on the other side. So
Oh
it's just like, no. And this is like stuff that lives in the environment forever as well. I was like, how am I going to
Right, I
destroy
know.
this white pride graffiti I've accidentally made?
That's amazing.
Um,
Ugh.
but yeah, it was an incredible party. It wasn't actually on Yom Kippur. Too many of us were
Yeah, yeah,
too
yeah.
religious to actually do it on Yom Kippur. But
That is something that just came up recently. Someone mentioned that exact thing. They said, like, a Yom Kippur ball sounds great. We're not going to be able to do it that way.
but it was still great. It was in
Yeah,
it was
absolutely.
during the 10 days, it was during the days between Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. And so it was,
Yeah,
it was during this holy period when God is
yeah,
supposedly,
still imbued.
yeah. And it's still, it felt like it. And like I said, it was also to remember the Battle of Cable Street, to raise money for anti-fascists in the UK. Today now, it makes me feel very old. It was, 11 years ago, I think.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
Um,
That time it does pass.
yeah,
I know.
it doesn't.
So so how does you're really I can really see this thread emerging, like, very, very clear. It's very much related to our, like, parts of our global Yiddish community. Vivi Lax also just released a podcast, I think,
Yeah,
about series
yeah,
about that we tried to help promote. And I still have to listen to it. I'll listen to it, I swear. And the so how does that come to this? And you're it's I love that, like, let's use this as a segue. Like, you're doing this very social activist movement. It's rooted in Jewish tradition, but you and other people are still feeling this connection to spirituality that that is very different than, like, let's say, the original people who are putting on these balls. So how do you get from there to this project and this book that you're writing on, these traditions of women in Jewish cemeteries, things that to me feel very spiritual, but also pointing even towards, like, the supernatural or something like that?
yeah. So actually, through being involved in all of this stuff, because Judas, we organized like regular services, and actually,
Oh,
it's
cool.
wild that a lot of people who I think had kind of found themselves a bit lost from Judaism, came back to it through
Yeah.
doing this kind of radical organizing, and I was definitely one of them. And I was interested. I was actually thinking of applying to rabbinical school, and I am very glad now that I did not, because I do not want to be clergy, especially right now. I have friends who do that, and it really is God's work. And nicht von mir gedacht. But
Yeah, yeah.
I did a program. I guess I am clergy, because I did a program called the Cohen program. So this trains people to be Hebrew priestesses. And it's a
Mm-hmm.
program founded by Jill Hammer, Rabbi Jill Hammer, and Taya Masher. And the idea is Jill Hammer has done this amazing research. I quote or cite her quite a bit in this article, the parts of the article that I wrote for the Jewish Women's Encyclopedia on kind of spiritual leadership roles, women's spiritual leadership roles in ancient Judaism. And she argues very well, that before the centralization of Judaism, like before the building of the temple and the kind of, the centralization of the priesthood, that there used to also be priestesses. And I think the thing that this was exciting to me as someone who grew up always feeling frustrated with the limits of like what one can do as a feminist, or with Judaism. I mean, feeling frustrated with things like, I don't know, I would go to study sessions and there'd be a bit where, like, I don't know, at Sinai, women are not allowed to come forward or whatever.
Sure.
And people
Yeah.
just say,
Yeah.
oh,
Yeah.
but it was a different time. And it's like, but these are our holy texts. And they're
Yeah.
saying,
Yeah. This sucks,
yeah,
though.
like that, a lot of it does suck. And that's how I felt. And so this idea of going back to, I guess, a Judaism, a lot of people would maybe say a Judaism that was more pagan. I don't think that would be the correct word, but
Right.
Jill Hammer and Taya Masher, they use the word earth-based, which I really like. So there's a lot of kind of learning how you have a you don't.
This is just it's just resonating.
Oh yeah,
Well, I'll tell
okay,
you how it's resonating. It's just very resonating, just things that are like very directly in my life, like
okay.
right now. But like, yeah.
Yeah, so I and there was just lots of weird and wonderful stuff about this program. I mean, really, I was just really interested in studying with them. So I signed up.
Where was this program?
So it was the way it works is you do 7 in-person retreats, which at
Oh, okay.
first were
Yeah.
in Connecticut at the Isabella Friedman Retreat Center, and
That makes
then
a lot of sense.
yeah, my program got interrupted by COVID, and so we finished it somewhere else. And then in between the retreats, it's just kind of online, self-study, and there were online
Yeah.
classes and stuff. And it was, every time I went, I was like, oh, I'm not a big enough hippie for this. Like,
Yeah.
I'm
Yeah.
not,
Yeah.
I'm not able to be as present as I need to be, or, but I always ended up loving it. And realizing that, maybe I am actually a hippie. I'm just not very good at acting like it. But
Sure. I accept you. I mean, I'm not a hippie either, but I accept you as a strange and wonderful person.
thank you. I mean, but yeah, it was just, essentially, yeah, learning kind of how Judaism connects to the kind of natural cycle of the world, like the cycle of the year, and thinking about how a lot of our festivals are connected to nature. That was something, and again, because it kind of takes it back from these stories, which, we said right at the beginning, I don't hate the stories. And I know a lot of people who choose to really grapple with the stories. And I think that's worthy as well, that's worth doing. But they are nasty sometimes. They
Yeah, and they certainly don't. They exclude a lot of people who aren't men.
yeah. Yeah.
Or all people who aren't men.
Yeah, and I mean, we've just had Purim, and I mean that it's a
Yeah.
horrible story. How
It's got yeah.
in fact, yeah, one of my friends who was also involved in Judas back in the day wrote a song called the Jewish Purim Massacre Song that deals with
Yeah.
this and kind of makes fun of it. And it's a very funny song. But, I think with Kohenet, it kind of felt like a lot of it was like back to basics. And actually, Purim is our version of Carnival. It's our version of what human beings do when the world has been dark for too long.
Human beings do, yeah.
And I think that really, that is always what I've been looking for. I don't have never subscribed to the idea that Judaism is like better than other religions, or
Yeah.
it's just, this is my ancestors. This connects me to, what my ancestors were doing, and it's what my mother chose, But it is just, there was something very refreshing to me in thinking, for example, of, Purim is our version of the carnival that human beings do when it gets too dark for too long. And, we just want to break out and it starts, getting light again. And so we just, we do crazy things and we put on costumes and we drink and whatever.
Yeah.
And I mean, that isn't, I don't want to speak for Kohenet. It's not that we didn't dive deeper into texts or, but there was something that I loved about it that was just felt like getting back to the kind of basics of we're human beings trying to live in the world. And how does Judaism inform that, or what?
Yeah, it's how is a manifestation of all these different aspects of just that, right?
And just that kind of most basic thing. And then, I was learning about women's roles, historic, ancient women's roles. And one of the roles that we learned about, and we study these different roles and also think about how to model them, how to reincarnate them or incarnate them, I guess, today.
Right.
And one of them was the role of the mourning woman, so these women who, would lead dirges and help people to express grief.
That's so good.
Yeah. And, we know that they existed in biblical times, like they're recorded in the book of Jeremiah, for example. And we know that they continued to exist because they're kind of traces of them in different texts. And another one was the witch. And the example of the witch that Jill Hammer opened with in her book and also in the classes that I took with her is the witch of Endor. And what the witch, actually, she's not described as a witch in the Bible. She's a keeper of an ancestor spirit. And what she does is she speaks to the dead. She can communicate with the dead on behalf of the living. And anyway, so I was doing this program kind of part-time. While I was also, at this point, I had started a master's in history and I was also studying full-time in Paris. I definitely do too many things. Studying.
Yeah, you're Jewish. Yeah. This makes sense. Most of us do.
Yeah. I did this full-time Yiddish intensive at the Paris Yiddish Center. And there I was studying Yiddish literature kind of, full time. So I was taking classes every day and I kept seeing these women pop up in texts, like I'm reading about a klogerin, a woman who's a klogerin. And I'm like, what's a klogerin? Oh, it's a woman who leads dirges or leads laments at funerals.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm like, what? She still existed in Eastern Europe.
Yeah.
In the 19th century. And I got really interested and I started just collecting texts about them. And then COVID happened and all my other work got temporarily put on pause. So I started translating the texts and then kind of trying to understand what these women were doing. And I started this website about it and, it became a project and an obsession.
Yeah, I want to get to some highlights about this work in a second. Your website is excellent. We're going to provide links to the article in the Jewish Women's Encyclopedia and also the website in the show notes for sure. And but I just want to think about, how much this relates to me and the idea of music and this idea of like I have always been someone who feels very uncomfortable with essentialisms in any way, shape, or form. But the way that I've come to look at it now is that there are things that are common to all humanity. We all live on the planet Earth for now. We all have DNA that's like 99.9999% the same. One of the other scientific theories that I really love is that there is a greater diversity within a similar group of what's the right word? Of people from a certain region than there are between groups. So, within Ashkenaz, Eastern European Jewry, there's going to be more genetic diversity within that group than between that group and other groups.
Yeah.
As like a whole. And I love that. And that there are forces beyond our understanding that are acting upon us every day, whether it's gravity or things that we call of a spiritual nature. But I mean, the thing is, when you play music, you have to be if you can't reject this stuff at some point, because you have these peak experiences that really are spiritual, that really are transcendent to the level that you have to at least say, well, I didn't understand how I got there from here. It's,
Yeah.
even just the phrase greater than the sum of its parts is something like this. And at the same time, I think that those things are so basic
Yeah.
to our existence as human beings as to almost be useless in terms of describing any kind of specificity or difference between us, which is why being able to root all of that stuff in something specific like Jewish history or any other kind of like system of history or system of practice relating to those kind of, like you said, back to basics, that is important, because that's the stuff that actually is specific enough to almost describe in a particular way, as opposed to like, well, the wind was here,
Yeah.
or, and so that sounds really exciting. And it also relates to a lot of feelings I have about, music, especially in the experimental side of my work, thinking about people who take who take the idea of performance to a ritualistic perspective from the point of music, and then sort of reinterpreting that or understanding ritual that then has a musical component as sort of the same, thing for me. But yeah, like what were some of the things that like really, like knocked your brain around as you were going through these texts? I mean, one of the ones that you mentioned was that it's still happening. And, I had a friend from Lebanon who I texted your article to, and he lives in West Philly, but he said, "Oh, I remember women who did this growing up, like in
Yeah.
the 80s,
Yeah.
the 1980s, so yeah." But like, what were some other things that like, either about the rituals themselves or like all this stuff that really like
Yeah.
slammed you into a new idea?
Yeah, I mean, I think the first thing was just that they were doing it, and there's this idea, like in Fiddler on the Roof, in tradition, the father is going to shul and the mother is just at home, and the mother's job is to
Right.
look after the kind of physical world, cook and clean, and so that father can read the holy books, and then
Yeah.
here are women, engaged in holy work. And it definitely was considered that. And that's, like I said, I'm now turning this all into a book. And one of the things I'm arguing is against this tendency to always put women in the kind of folklore box and men in the religion. And it's like, what is folklore? What is religion? Who gets to decide
Yeah.
that? Because the more I've found examples of women who were doing this, they were actually generally very educated, and they were often like related to male religious elites. These were not, when I first found them, I thought, oh, witches, cool, like
Yeah,
they're going to be
cool.
living in like a
Totally.
hut in the woods. But no, they were often, they were the women who also looked after the women's section of the synagogue. Like this was, so I think, the first thing was kind of women had a role in Ashkenazi Judaism. And then the second thing was speaking to the dead was part of Ashkenazi Judaism. Speaking to the dead, listening to the dead, and mourning the dead. And I think, yeah, I think those two things, definitely as someone who's experienced loss as a young age, and in
Right.
Britain, where we are famous for not expressing emotions. I was definitely told not to cry even as a
I'm
child when I
sorry.
lost my mum, and I think which is just very normal. Unfortunately, this is part of our culture.
Unfortunately. Yeah, that's
But
right.
here, I've, reading these women's lamentations, and they're saying, this sucks, this is awful. What am I
Yeah.
supposed to do? They're not saying, there is a kind of, oh, they're in a better place. But they're like, death is awful and it's terrifying. And they're really expressing that. And I think there's something incredibly healthy and needed there.
Yes.
And similarly with talking to the dead, our relationship with someone doesn't end just because they're gone. And, so they seem to be modeling these two really important functions kind of psychologically for the community. But also, I think the other thing that is exciting for me is that it shows us that Judaism actually didn't look like what we think it looked like.
That's right.
You know? And I think especially kind of what is called Orthodox Judaism today, will kind of claim that we practice Judaism, you know, as it has always been
As it
practiced.
was,
Yeah,
yes, that's
this is
right. But
traditional, and no,
there,
yeah,
there's no original. Yeah, you know, those original constructionists can go shove it because they never existed. There's no such thing as like, because everything. I mean, you know, people love. I kind of hate this now, but like you know, you can't quantum physics. You can't observe something without, you know, putting your own interpretation on it,
right.
because and that might have a physical effect, as these people suggest. But like, yeah, I mean, one of the things that I really noticed in that article was how this kind of fight actually is also ancient. This
Mhm.
fight of like basically patriarchy defining the religion and circumscribing women away from these quote unquote important roles goes all the way back to, I mean, there's this part where Maimonides is sort of saying, this is what you can do and this is what you can't do. And I'm like, who cares, man? This ain't even your thing. Like, what are you talking about? And you know, and then also what was the Zohar, and it actually reminded me a lot of the parallels between music and rabbis, and how that was a battle in in
Mm.
like, you know, in sort of Enlightenment area and the rise of Hasidism, and like, and how instrumental music was forbidden, and then they were like, well, you can do it for the wedding because we're actually losing this battle, so we're going to try to put a rule down
Yeah,
that says, oh, this is where it's okay, and then that has its own thing, and then, you know, and how the stuff we do today is completely, you know, influenced by all those decisions or all those fights or whatever, you know,
yeah,
in as musicians. But it really feels like, I mean, but to bring it back to like, yeah, I mean, they were. It's funny because on the one hand, these patriarchal forces are trying to kind of like enclose women's activity and kind of remove them and write them out of the picture, like take control over their narrative. And then you have these things that just exist, you know. There was this parable of the king and the sons that I read about that was really fascinating, where this sort of this idea of God can't do it, like God as the male aspect can't grieve correctly for his own son, like his own
uh,
creation, and needs this like women
the
who are
feminine
these who
aspect.
can talk, the feminine aspect to like to actually like bring the emotion, to bring the grief, to bring the what it takes to move forward.
Yeah, yeah, there definitely is. You know, that's a bit of this, because I'm kind of coming to this in lots of different ways. Like I'm coming to this
Yeah.
research as a historian who's been, you know, done some degrees and so on, and you know, is trying as much as possible to kind of talk about what actually happened in the past and so on, and why it's
Right.
relevant and so on. But then I'm also, you know, coming as someone who is spiritual and is, you know, and with these rituals, you know, I've done them. I never expected
Yeah.
to, but I've measured cemeteries. I've become someone who is known for
Wait.
measuring cemeteries.
Tell us about measuring cemeteries. Like, what's that?
So this was a ritual. It seems to have originated in the Middle Ages, when Catholics also were, sorry, in the medieval period, when Catholics also were, they would measure the shrines of saints when somebody
Okay.
was ill, or when they, you know, when there was a kind of a crisis, and they would use the thread to make candles that would be donated to the church. So it was a kind of
Ah.
two things there. They're measuring the grave to make contact with the person who's buried there, and ask for their help, ask them to I don't actually know what the Catholic practice was, but in the Jewish practice, ask them to pray on behalf of the living, because the dead
Mm-hmm.
are closer to God than us, so they have a kind of, they're in heaven, they have a, you know, direct
Yeah, yeah,
line
yeah.
that we don't have. And then the act of donating the synagogues, the synagogues, the candles, and for Jews they would be donated to the synagogue, is a kind of offering, you know, as well, that will please God. It's a mitzvah. It's allowing the dead to take part in this mitzvah. So it's this really cool thing where like lots of different things are happening. You're making contact with the dead, and you're also engaging in a relationship with them where you're asking them to do something for you, to go and pray in heaven and advocate in the divine court. So there's this belief in, that good or bad things happen to us on the basis of divine decrees. And the dead can go and essentially kind of act as our lawyers, which feels very Jewish as well. In the
That does feel,
divine,
certainly
I
does to
mean,
me.
I'm from a family of Jewish lawyers, so
Same here. How about that?
and they so the dead can go and they can advocate for us, and they can say, no, this person didn't really mean to do this, so they shouldn't be punished, or look at how great this person has been this year, they deserve good things, and so on. So we're asking the dead to do something for us, and then we're also doing something for them. We're remembering them. We're donating these candles that have been in direct contact with their grave, and it's this kind of creating this ongoing relationship. So this seems to have started, I think, in the 12th century. Chava Weisler is the person who's really written about this practice in a kind of in a scholarly, way. And but Jewish women are practicing it right up until the eve of the Holocaust. And in the early 20th century, this is actually seen as a kind of sign of frumkeit. It's like, this is what really, really religious Jewish women do. Is they still measure graves. At some point, Jewish women started measuring the whole cemetery as well. And that seems to be unique to Eastern Europe. And there was a famous Polish Jewish anthropologist called Regina Lilientowa. I'm sure I'm pronouncing that name incorrectly, but I've only read her name. I've never spoken to her. That she thought that the practice of measuring the cemetery replaced another practice of measuring the person who was unwell and who needed help. But anyway, they would when you measure the cemetery, you're asking all the dead, and the prayers for it that I've studied and translated, they're kind of incredible. You're literally, these women are there in the cemetery calling on all of the dead, and not even just all of the dead in that cemetery. They're calling on biblical ancestors, literally everyone, all the good people. Generally for them, it's all the good Jews. And this is where, I kind of feel some discomfort with the practice myself, or with the way that they speak about it. All the good Jews in the world, come together and help this person, this was generally something that was practiced, if someone was very, very ill, or if there's a war or a plague, there's a crisis. Also in Elul, to make candles for Yom Kippur, which is the big annual crisis, but it's a life or death practice. It's a practice that was done to save people's lives.
Hat der ore Mann sein Semmel mit Putter es der Nogid Ches Chalesen hat der ore Mann.
I'd love to make a bunch of jokes about how this is Radiant Other's first ad break, but really I'm here to tell you about the campaign to support Muhammad and family to survive and rebuild in Gaza that Annie helps lead and is supporting. We're releasing this episode on Nakba Day, the day that is the memory of the catastrophe that befell the Palestinian people. And so this is a perfect time to support a family, to rebuild, to keep them fed, provided with the essentials they need to survive. I ran into a friend in Philadelphia the other day who's run similar campaigns, and she reminded me that a family in this case really just doesn't mean the kind of 3 to 5 people that we have here, but really a multi-generational, huge group of people who are connected through blood and many other ways, who are living in Gaza, who do not have what they need to survive, let alone thrive. And so we're asking for your help to support this family, this grand idea of a family. So please go to the show notes and give what you can.
Trog der ore Mann Mem Maschke trinkt der Nogid Nun Michter ist der Oreman. Samech, samet seine Kleider, trug der Nogit. Ein Elend ist der Oreman. Pei, Piepkes gebrotene ist der Nogit. Sadik Zuris hat der
Oh, that's wonderful.
Oreman.
I love, and I love that it's so rooted. I love that it requires ritual, but and that there are that we actually have some of these prayers to like check out and use. That's amazing. I was also really noticed that this was sort of something that generally older women
Yeah.
would be involved in, and that also that they were paid for this. This was
Yeah,
paid work,
yeah.
right?
Yeah, that,
It's really wild.
yeah, and that's important. They're functionaries. They're part of the Jewish,
Yeah.
they're not generally hired by, or as far as I know, they were never hired by the Kahal, by the communal board that governed the community. But yeah, they're paid. People pay, and
Yeah.
not just by women. They're paid by,
Right.
there are lots of photos of these women with people who appear to be men also, and that's
Yeah.
pretty incredible. Like that isn't the picture that we have of kind of old traditional Judaism, where it's the woman who's holding the
Correct.
prayer book and leading, and men are sitting around on the gravestones and they're listening. And it,
Wow.
that is, I do think it's important.
I loved also that it was clearly like an oral tradition, which sort of puts it in the realm of like an improvisational practice.
Yeah. I've spoken to musicians about this before, about kind of how wonderful it would be. And I know that Noam Lerman is doing this. Noam Lerman is someone I've written with.
Yeah, sure.
I've worked with quite a bit. And they do incredible work, like setting tchinas to music. There
Right.
were quite a few examples of that on the Lieder mit Palästina album I felt, as well, of
Yeah, sure.
dirges, and kind of imagining.
Ashkenazi Jews love a
Right.
good dirge.
Yeah, and I do wonder,
regardless of the subject.
I wonder if these women were singing. That's something I don't know, I assume it's a kind of chant.
I can't.
Yeah.
I can't imagine that they weren't
No.
intoning in a way that you could
I
call
agree.
singing. I mean, even traditional prayer is singing to a degree. We call this singing when you look at other. That you can. I don't know what the current when we ignorantly look at other cultures or record. When you listen to when you discover records of like some faraway culture as like a young person, you're like, oh, these vocals, this vocal style, this singing style, and it's like they may, who knows what they call it. So we get the same, it is singing for sure, because it's definitely not, because it's like music is one of those things. What is music? Music is like, one of the definitions that I like is music is like sound with human intention for it to be considered music, because birds don't, I don't know, the bird song music to birds. I don't know, but this is singing kind of by that definition in a way.
Is bird song music to birds? That's a great question.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Like, and like I was thinking about how much this is like really feeling that sense that you're talking about how this is a huge like sort of break with this sort of kind of foundational idea, which either could be from an Orthodox Jewish setting of like, this is the way it was done, this kind of originalism, like Antonin Scalia, U.S. Supreme Court kind of originalism, versus like, or even Fiddler on the Roof, like you mentioned, which is a really good thing to point out, how that like two lines in that two verses in that song circumscribe, like enclose these roles for people, and how this is just like a humongous like pushback to that. And like you said, it also is kind of like, it's just, but this is the thing. When we look at what actually happened, it's like, I don't know. I said this thing about music yesterday where I was like, oh, well, this thing's a recipe. It's not a food. You know, it's like a song is food, like a scale is a recipe, or it's like an ingredient,
Yeah.
you know? And this is like these stories are these like, I mean, they're just all the, it's just like, it's you know, it's just the weakest version of the food. And when you get to the actual history, like and it's not like we're saying this is what happened exactly right. It's like, this is what happened where we just let what we can figure out about what happened just wash over us and kind of like start to like sort of ferment in it and transform.
For sure.
First of all, you just have more to work. It's a richer situation. It leaves us like much like richer as humanely richer to like then act in the present in kind of any ways.
Yeah, I mean, for sure, you know, I think that this idea that, you know, the women stay at home and they look after the material world, or maybe they run the business and the shop, and so that the men can do the spiritual work. You know, that is the recipe. That's the ideal. That's the rabbinic ideal. You know, I think this comes from the Talmud.
The male.
The Ashes Chayil, the woman who doesn't really get concerned in spiritual matters because men's prayer and men's study is more important. That's what counts. You know, these are the positive commandments. But that doesn't mean that women just did that. You know, it doesn't mean that value wasn't recognized in women's spirituality as well. You know, so, you know, and I don't want to undermine with my work the extent to which patriarchy still very much existed. And, you know, these women were not, they were not recognized as rabbis, for example. You know, but they were important, you know, they really were.
Yeah.
There's one woman who,
I think it's,
there's one woman who even, I make a big deal. I think she features in the articles I wrote. She even received letters from people who used to live in her town who were now in America. They would send her letters and pay her to take the letters and read them to the dead in the cemetery. And then she would write down the dead's replies and send them back to America. So, you know, even if you were in America, you could, and, you know, it's just, it's really incredible. And some of them, you know, were really regarded as holy women by their communities.
Yeah. Like, how do you deal with the fact that this is like, you're like sort of asserting a women's role versus like this kind of world we live in where you're not really trying to live in such a binary way, but it is restorative, you know?
Yeah. I mean, this is something I'm, you know, going to write about in the book as well, is that this is somewhere that I feel kind of uncomfortable, because I also feel to some extent it's like bolstering this idea that, you know, women are emotional and men are not emotional.
There's got to be there's got to be this bigger picture where it's like, no, the man gave up this opportunity, and the women, but also kind of forced the women into this role, into these spaces by I honestly, I keep thinking about, do you ever listen to the Dig podcast? This is a very left wing thing.
Yeah.
So that guy used to live, he was my neighbor for a while. But I used to see him at parties all the time, Daniel. But he did this great 2-part with this guy who was a scholar of the British Commons and the enclosure of the Commons. And it's really useful because there's this stuff about ritual being these spaces in which the people basically resist the enclosure by capital. Or like, you know, like the idea, like kind of even going back to the Bible, this that thing about the grain, and you have to leave the stuff that falls on the ground for the people to take, and it's like this idea of the commons, and I just feel like there's so much like given up. We just gave up so much. That then
I agree.
Yeah. So it is supposed to be everybody doing this, and the historical contingencies meant that it was like one way or the other.
Yeah, and I mean, you know, I don't know, studying like Ashkenazi, you know, 19th and 20th century Ashkenazi Jewish culture, you know, of course, the gender binary is
hard,
so enforced. There's no way around it. And yet, there are also big differences. Like the ideal of the Jewish man was so different than the kind of masculine ideal today.
Oh, sure.
You know, there was this kind of studious, often what we would consider quite effeminate, everybody was more emotional.
Yeah.
And emotions were not considered a sign of weakness. They were considered a sign of strength. And, you know, I think the reason that these women are in the cemetery is because the cemetery is like a kind of dodgy place.
Yeah.
And so religious men don't want to go there because it's a contaminating place. And I don't think it actually is so much to do with women being the emotional ones.
Oh, this would be great for the sci-fi or fantasy story where it's like the men get destroyed when they try to go in the cemetery and do the work because their like conception of holiness is like allows them to be contaminated. You know?
Right. Yeah. No, I think that's, but yeah, other stuff that I'm very excited about that, I'm seeing people doing with this is kind of how to queer it, how to, and all of that, again, we can only do that in conversation with our ancestors because we do not know that they would want us to do that.
Correct.
But that's how this works.
That's how it works, because the thing is, there's only right now, but we get to have everything else also right now.
Yeah,
Awesome.
exactly. No, it's, you learn to be respectful of the past and also,
Yeah,
you
I
live in the
mean,
present.
my entire, a huge part of my musical work is based on sort of figuring out what the practices of these trombonists were on these scratchy old recordings from 100 years ago, and
Wow.
and then figuring out how to do it in the present, and you come up with your own ideas about it. I mean, I remember when I was validated in hearing a new old recording, and I was like, oh, my theories of this fit that data or whatever. And I was like, okay, so like, this is not how these guys thought about it, but it's a way to hold what they did in a way that's useful, that's doable today. Well, actually, it's funny. I was thinking about how the modern concept of the American superhero, Superman, Spider-Man, written by Jews, created by Jews. Like Kal-El is the Kryptonian name for Superman. It's not actually very, like, there's no one's trying to hide. They just did it. And how I was just like, well, what would these, like, I want to see these like adaptations of like the superheroes, some Klugmutters, like what would this be? And and not that we need heroes, because we actually don't need heroes. We need like people, but just that there is this whole other thing that is also like, it's ours. And I was talking, my wife, Christiana Kugel, has recently gotten really into witchcraft and herbalism and things like that. And she was telling me about this thing about closed traditions or closed practices versus open practices. So in a nutshell, practices that are from extremely oppressed communities are often closed practices, because when their practices are revealed, they get appropriated and misused and things like that. So, indigenous practices are often closed practices, whereas like Eastern European and Wicca stuff are considered open practices, because they're kind of just out there. You do it. It's not really taking away anybody's life, and it's an open practice. And I always think of, like, for whatever reason, and then we can talk about all the reasons, but I don't really want to do it right now. Yiddish culture is an open practice, this huge open practice, and we make it. We go, it's open, come on in, right? And that but they would be so much fun to do. Like, people should get in here and, like, the Witch of Endor. I mean, come on, like, write that shit, like, I want to read. And it actually, I mean, one thing it reminded me of is a friend of the podcast, singer Allie Halpert, who's also, I would say, in community with Noam and other people, or I met all those folks at the same time through, like, Let My People Sing stuff in Philly, activities in Philly and stuff like that. Recommended this book called The Fifth Sacred Thing by a writer named Starhawk, who is, like, definitely on the sort of witchiest end of things, but also the first chapter is about this, like, Ashkenazi Jewish lady who's, like, in the future and stuff. And I was like, man, there it is, that Jewish thing to, like, go back to like, it was so Jewish, this like book about magic and stuff like that. And it just reminded me so much like this. And I don't know if that writer knows about these histories, but was kind of doing it like it was in this
Yeah.
book just as it was.
Yeah, I mean,
I think
something that's been really exciting about this. So, I made this website in 2020, and it was not like the idea was, it was actually part of my project that I did for the Kohenet Hebrew Priestess Institute. And I just kind of wanted to translate the materials and make them available to people. But it's been so exciting that people have been using them. Sometimes it's infuriating. Sometimes my stuff will pop up out of nowhere and I'm like, oh, there it is. But, it's amazing to see what people are doing with it. And also people who are much, much more skilled than I am as ritualists or as leaders of prayer. I don't actually feel very comfortable. I like translating, I like studying, I like working out, how things worked. I'm not actually the most skilled prayer leader. And then seeing, and certainly, as I said, grew up in Britain, not the person to be leading dirges. But to see people doing that, Jeremiah Lockwood wrote an amazing, I guess it was kind of an operetta. I feel like possibly I'm using the wrong musical terminology, but three of the texts that I found, that as part of his Chazones project they perform. And that was just incredible for me to hear them and to hear these women as well being kind of performed, and that it's just been amazing. And I keep, people are measuring cemeteries. I moved to Scotland to start my PhD here, and someone invited me to a cemetery measuring event. And then they were like, oh, you're the person who actually translated the stuff.
Good. At least they figured that out. Yeah.
And, but this wasn't like offensive. This was incredible to just find out that this is happening. And, that it was going to happen without me or with me or without me. But that's kind of even better because people are actually doing these things and they're meaningful. And that's incredible.
Yeah. No, I mean, this kind of reminds me of, and that's, first of all, congratulations. You've done some significant work.
Like I said.
And it reminds me of this idea of like klezmer revival. People are like, oh, the klezmer revival. It's like, whatever. It's about getting it here so we can use it.
I mean, I definitely...
And you did it.
I mean, it's definitely not just me. There's an organization called Narrow Bridge Candles, and they were doing cemetery measuring and making soul candles, I think, before I did this. And like I said, Chava Weisler is the scholar who really, I kind of found out about it through her work, which was cited somewhere else, and then I found it in Yiddish. But what I did was, just make a lot of the Yiddish material available, and I think I've popularized it, and I've put a lot of stuff out there, and led workshops. Like I led a cemetery measuring workshop at Yiddish Summer Weimar a few years ago, and that's when I discovered, because I was teaching Yiddish there, and we also needed to come up with kind of cultural activities. And, I do sing and I like Yiddish songs, but I'm like, it's Yiddish Summer Weimar. They're learning with Sasha Luria. Like, what am I going to teach you? Yiddish
whatever,
songs. But I was like, I got to come up with something that's a bit different. And then I was like, I just bought some string and I, asked the students, I said, this is really weird and maybe you're going to say no, but do you want to go and measure the cemetery? And I got a big group. People found it like incredibly meaningful. And that was amazing for me, because I kind of thought I'm just some weirdo who, I don't know, is obsessed with dead people or and it was wonderful.
But in a much better way than the rest of the narrative, the general narrative of being obsessed with dead people.
Yeah. And and that, and then when I moved to Brooklyn, I bought the thread with me, and then we had a soul candle making workshop, and then we organized another one, and it's just it's been really exciting to kind of bring that kind of stuff into Yiddish spaces, but also to see it taking off. And
that's awesome. Yeah, and so like to bring it around to like the political, I mean, you talked about a lot about your political work and your orientation, and we mentioned up top like how we're kind of like the lack of understanding of real history, but also the lack of actual grieving and sort of communing with the dead is destroying our entire world right now, I would say, and especially us Jews, we need this. Like, this is going to be part of our like ability to like come back from whatever the hell that we're unleashing upon Palestinian people as like a state of Israel and now in all other parts of the world. Like, this is the rest of it, we're going to have to ask the dead what we need to do, and all this stuff. So like, what are the ways, like, what are some of the ways that you either can imagine happening or you've seen happen or like that you just want to see for yourself or for this other, like, what are the ways that this, and we have this idea of like, I saw one of the things you said, what is our role as Jewish and Yiddish scholars in this moment? But I think it's like deeper than that, especially when you're talking about this ability to like access ritual, like where have you been? Where do you want to go? Like, what are your hopes and dreams here?
I mean, I think that anywhere I want to go, it's going to take a lot of us. I don't have any aspirations that me or my work alone will, will do anything on its own. But I actually wrote about, maybe I'll send you a link to the article because I feel like I probably, expressed it more eloquently than I will now, but I'll try as well. I wrote an article for a British Jewish publication called Vashti about cemetery measuring and what this means in a time of genocide. Because actually, the first time I measured a cemetery was not in Weimar. It was, and this was before when I first started translating the texts about this and kind of studying it, I really did not think I would ever practice any, that wasn't my intention. I was kind of like, I want to translate this stuff so other people can do it. Other people who are ritualists and who are better at being hippies than I am. And I was visiting. I went on an impulse. Actually, I was teaching in Vilnius for a weekend, and then I'd just been paid and I had some free time, so I rented a car and I drove to the town that my great-great-grandfather came to the UK from, which is in Lithuania. And it was one of the first three towns to fall victim to the Holocaust. It was one of the first three towns the Germans invaded. And I knew this because I've been obsessed with history and with Holocaust history since I was very young. Even when I did my undergraduate degree, I wrote a paper on the Holocaust in these towns, and I read the SS documents, and I've really been there. And but somehow, now that I'd been learning Yiddish and I'd read a little bit of a great uncle's memoir, and I felt like some hope, that maybe through Yiddish I'm going to discover something else in this place. But when I got there, the first thing I see is this sign that says Jewish Genocide Monument. And it's in Lithuanian, but somehow I can understand those words. I understand Jewish and genocide, and it points into the woods. And, so I park and go into the woods, and there is a monument to the men who were murdered. And there was nothing left of Jewish life in this town. I found a place where I could buy a guidebook, and I kind of walked around trying to see the mikveh used to be there, and now it's a supermarket, and the synagogue used to be there, and it's an abandoned hotel. And the only thing that was left with the cemetery, but when I got there, there was another monument to the women. The women had been murdered in the cemetery. And I just kind of reached my it felt like something went kind of pop in my brain, and I'm like, I can't, and I'd been traveling in Eastern Europe, and I'd been to, Ponar outside Vilna, and I'd said Kaddish, and it was like, this isn't enough. And I actually felt like I don't want to mourn or grieve, and I'm tired of seeing kind of, Israeli flags would often pop up, not in this cemetery, but in other monuments I, visited. And then there were the debates in Eastern Europe about, the legacy. There was a Soviet monument that said, these were Soviet citizens who were murdered. And then there's all of this kind of, And I'm
Right.
just like, I wanted to talk to the dead. And I'd been reading these texts about the women who did that. And so I went and I bought some wool because I couldn't find thread. And I'm like, I'm going to measure this cemetery and I'm going to talk to the dead. And I did it. And I felt completely insane. And there was a drunk man who started shouting at me while I was doing this. And I
Yes.
shouted back at him in
Yes.
Yiddish. I said, I would be able to tell you what I was doing if anyone still spoke Yiddish here. And it's not my fault that they don't.
Ah, my
And I
goodness.
just, but
That's
I spoke
beautiful.
to the dead. And what I found I wanted to say was I wanted to let them go. It felt so heavy. And I kind of felt like you,
Yes.
the people who were murdered in the Holocaust, like they do so much work for us. They're
Yes.
here.
And they're sort of in and enclosed
Right.
too. They're right.
And because I had grown up, and I think about that a lot these past 2 years watching the genocide in Gaza, and seeing kind of, I don't know, I mean, another moment that my brain almost exploded was like seeing Israeli officials in the UN with a gold star on their, arguing that this is why we have to be allowed to carry out these acts of mass murder,
Yes.
because we were victims of mass murder. And it does feel like something, that there is some benefit, some healing of this huge trauma, that we still carry, those of us who are descended from Jews from Eastern Europe, or anyone who works in Yiddish culture.
Yeah, all of our brains are
Right.
broken, no matter
And
brothers.
so
Yes.
I have been thinking, because it seems to me that these rituals did kind of finally die out after the Holocaust. And actually, when
Okay.
I was reading for the article I wrote on Jewish mourning women, I read an amazing book by Tova Gamliel, who writes about Yemenite Jewish wailing women in Israel. And one of the people she
Mm-hmm.
interviewed, they said, like, the Ashkenazim, they don't have any of these practices. Like, they are not in touch
Right.
with
Yeah.
their
Yeah.
emotions. And it really struck me, and I wanted to talk back and say, well, they were, but another one of her interviewees, and I quoted it in the article, said that she felt like the the death and the destruction that they'd seen since moving to Israel kind of was contributing to the decline of whaling. I'm paraphrasing, so and I'm paraphrasing.
No, I have the quote here. Yeah, you wrote, in Israel, there's so much pain, so many problems that this wailing is redundant. Besides, there's so much murder that people don't cry anymore. The tears have dried up. But we need to get those tears flowing
Yeah,
again. I think that this is really true. I just want to give, especially being in Philly, the home of Sun Ra and all this stuff. There's this quote from this Afrofuturist musician Sun Ra, who did this whole thing worth investigating. But he has this sort of phrase where he says, if you've tried everything that's possible, and it hasn't worked, it's time to try the impossible. And that when you said about like sort of snapping at that moment, that phrase just popped into my head, because the possible / like the things that we're told are real, or the way things are, or whatever, ran out. Like, you hit a wall, you ran out. And so you had to try something that was impossible, that you had to bring something from somewhere else. And it was this cemetery measuring ritual and technology. I actually don't like that word, but people call it like a
yeah.
technology. But like this practice that you had, this way of interacting with getting back to basics, getting back to what was real, which was your experience in that place at that time. Absolutely
Yeah, and I
real.
mean, I don't know if any spirits heard me. If they did, if there were any Feldmesterin cemetery measuring women looking at me, they would have been very angry because I did it completely wrong. And I think I was wearing
Sure, but
shorts, and they're like, what is she doing? But for me, this experience of, like, and I think I said this actually when we were chatting at the beginning, the experience also of not saying, because I felt this, since the beginning of this war, this genocide in Gaza, of kind of wanting to say, like, if my ancestors could see this, they would be horrified. And the thing is, I actually don't know. But when we turn it around and I say, I want you to be horrified, I'm asking
Yeah.
you and because there's something so healthy for us actually in doing this and saying, and I think we do this very often with ancestry is we want to claim stories. I write in my other research, I'm writing about the International Brigades, one of the most kind of contested histories. On the one hand, they're these heroic anti-fascists. On the other hand, they're Stalinists, or they're led by
Sure,
Stalinists.
yeah.
And, there's this huge debates over their legacy. But ultimately, with these practices, we're not turning around and saying, this is who you are and this is what you would have said and this is what you represent. But we're saying this is who we are. And this is what we want from our ancestors and what we need. And I think there's kind of something healthier in that. And I think it really is needed. Like I said, for all of us who are still dealing in one way or another with the trauma of the Holocaust, and I think it's really urgent in the way that this trauma continues to affect ongoing trauma.
Absolutely. And I want to add the trauma of the COVID-19 pandemic, which talk about no grief was, we were not allowed to grieve that. And I also want to say that this is like restorative, not in the sense of restoring things to their rightful place, because like you said, we don't actually know what that was. And also it wouldn't totally, if they time traveled today, it's not the same thing, but it's restorative in terms of restoring our ability to make choices and to discover new possibilities for ourselves and like our people and our world, you know?
Yeah, it's interesting that you mentioned COVID because another time that I've put these practices into practice was with something that Noam Lerman organized, which was in 2023, wailing for 3 years of the pandemic. And it was exactly that. They organized a kind of grief circle. And I brought some examples of Yiddish Kloggenischen or Kloggereien, the laments that these women used to recite and come up with on the spot, and we use them as a kind of template to for speaking from the heart, for saying everything that's been hard. And I think a lot of people, and I and Noam are both in the group of also of being vulnerable people who for different reasons weren't able to go back to normal in the way that everybody else was. And that was a really it was a really beautiful thing to be able to be part of that. And this involved, it also had people bringing different practices from different traditions, because again, this, as you said earlier, this kind of practice of dirges, of lamentation, it's not at all unique to Jews. And it's often women, who are doing it in other communities as well.
Yeah, no, that is really, really interesting. There's so many more threads that I want to pull on, but I think that's a good place to wrap it. And so, Annie, thank you so much for all of your work and for all of your connecting yourself to your work and this history, and for bringing us along with you.
Well, thank you so much. Thanks for having me, and thanks for this podcast that allows me to listen to my friends, even though I no longer live in New York.
My pleasure.
Gloss ist Gloss in es Gitter Klingo. Wenn man ist verliebt, schmeit man euch verliebt. Aber wie gesinnt, kann man glücklich sein.
Well, that was my conversation with Annie Gottfried Cohen. We really got into it. I am so glad that she is doing the work she's doing to illuminate these corners of Jewish history, Jewish ritual practice, the role of women, the importance of revealing these histories so that we know there was more than we were taught, and that there can be more than what we can see in our world right now. It means a lot to me, and I hope it means a lot to you too. And I'm so glad you're coming on this journey with us. As this podcast just keeps going, it keeps evolving, the ideas that we are able to present in the way that I feel like I'm trying to make these connections, this web of connections, throughout our beautiful Yiddish, our glorious Jewish, and hopefully throughout our entire world. So I hope you'll stick with us. I hope you'll support us and what we believe in here at this podcast. That's it for today. If you're in Philly, I hope I see you on Sunday, May 17th, for Philly in Einem. And if you're not in Philly, I hope I see you on the internet or somewhere at a show. And in the meantime, I hope you're all well, and good Shabbos.
Einem in die ganze Welt. Einer meint das ganze Glück hängt nur auf ihn Geld. Sollen alle sicher, sollen alle kriechen, nur ich tracht bei mir. Ich darf das auf Kapores, weil das Glück steht bei mein Tier. Tinkel, tinkel wie ein Keiler. Als man ist verliebt, kriegt man Lingenfehler. Aber wie gesinnt, kann man glücklich sein.